The room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that settles naturally between conversations. This was different. Heavy. Absolute. The kind of silence that makes your chest tighten because you know something profound is about to happen. Prince William stood at the podium, fingers gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Behind him, the ancient stone walls of Kensington Palace bore witness to a moment 26 years in the making. He cleared his throat once, then twice. His eyes, those unmistakable blue eyes so hauntingly familiar to anyone who ever loved his mother, glistened under the television lights. For 26 years, the world had waited for this. For 26 years, the British press had speculated, prodded, and begged for a single unfiltered sentence from the boy who walked behind the coffin. The teenager who, at 15 years old, was asked to perform the most public act of grief in modern history. The man who had never truly spoken about what happened inside his heart that day, or any day since. Until now. What happened next sent shockwaves through Westminster Abbey, through the crowds gathered outside the palace gates, through living rooms from Manchester to Melbourne. Grown men wept. Journalists who had covered the royal family for decades set down their notebooks and simply listened, tears streaming down their faces. Because what William finally said wasn't a rehearsed statement. It wasn't careful palace-approved language designed to reveal nothing while pretending to reveal something. It was the raw, unfiltered truth from a son who had carried an impossible weight for almost 3 decades. And it started with 4 words no one expected. I never told her. Why does this moment matter? Why? Nearly 3 decades after a car crash in a Paris tunnel, does the world still hold its breath when Diana's sons speak her name? Because Diana wasn't just a princess. She was a mother who changed what it meant to be royal. She held AIDS patients when the world was terrified to touch them. She walked through minefields in Angola when diplomats told her to stay home. She sat on hospital beds and held hands and whispered to dying children that they were loved, truly loved, when their own families had abandoned them. And then she was gone. The grief that followed was unlike anything the modern world had witnessed. An estimated 2.5 billion people watched her funeral. Flowers piled 5 feet deep outside Kensington Palace. The sea of bouquets stretched so far, the scent of lilies and roses hung over central London for weeks. Strangers sobbed in the streets. Grown men who had never cried in their lives found themselves weeping in front of television sets. But at the center of that global grief were 2 little boys, William 15, Harry 12. Children who had lost their mother in the most violent, public, and traumatic way imaginable. For 26 years, William protected that wound. He built walls around it. He rarely spoke Diana's name in public. And when he did, it was in carefully measured sentences that revealed nothing of the storm inside. The British stiff upper lip. The royal protocol. The expectation that princes don't cry, don't break, don't bleed in public. Until that night at Kensington Palace. The speech William delivered didn't just break protocol. It shattered it. And in doing so, it opened a window into grief, guilt, and love that millions of people recognize from their own lives. That's why this story matters. Because beneath the tiaras and titles, beneath the palaces and protocols, this is a story about a son who finally told the truth about losing his mother. And in telling his truth, he told ours too. In this documentary, we'll trace the complete emotional journey of William's long silence and what finally broke it. We'll explore the childhood memories Diana deliberately created, knowing her time was limited. We'll examine the devastating 12 days between Diana's death and her funeral, when 2 young princes were forced to grieve in front of the entire world. We'll uncover the private moments the public never saw, the conversations behind palace doors, the decisions that haunted William into adulthood, and the therapy sessions where a future king finally allowed himself to fall apart. We'll reveal what happened inside Kensington Palace on the night William delivered his speech. The preparation, the hesitation, the last-minute decision that changed everything. We'll analyze the words themselves, what they revealed and what they carefully didn't say. We'll speak to royal correspondents who witnessed the moment firsthand and mental health experts who explain why this single speech may have done more for grief awareness than decades of public health campaigns. And we'll confront the question that has haunted the monarchy for 26 years. Can a son ever truly heal from a wound the whole world watched him receive? This is the story of a prince who finally stopped being a prince long enough to be a son. And a nation that realized it was still grieving too. To understand what happened that night at Kensington Palace, we have to go back. Not to August 31st, 1997, the night of the crash, but further. To a childhood deliberately designed to be remembered. Diana knew. That's what those closest to her have revealed in the years since her death. She knew her time was limited. Whether it was intuition, paranoia, or something more profound, Diana raised her sons with an urgency that only makes sense in retrospect. She didn't parent like a princess. She parented like a mother running out of time. While Charles took the boys shooting and fishing, adhering to traditional royal masculine rituals, Diana showed them a different world entirely. She took them to homeless shelters when William was just 11 years old. She brought Harry to visit AIDS patients at a time when the stigma was so severe that healthcare workers wore hazmat suits. She made them wait in line at McDonald's. She took them to amusement parks and let them wear jeans and baseball caps. She insisted they attend school with other children rather than being tutored in the palace. William and Harry had two different educations. A former palace aide told biographer Andrew Morton. There was the education their father provided, history, protocol, duty. And there was the education Diana provided, empathy, kindness, the understanding that suffering doesn't care about titles. Diana's friends have spoken about her deliberate efforts to create memories. She would pull William out of school for surprise trips to the cinema. She organized elaborate treasure hunts through Kensington Palace. She wrote them letters, hundreds of letters, meant to be opened at different stages of their lives. She recorded messages on cassette tapes, her voice preserved for moments she feared she wouldn't witness. Graduations, weddings, the births of her grandchildren. The most famous of these memories, of course, involves the Queen of People's Hearts herself. In 1991, Diana arranged for William's favorite models, Cindy Crawford, Christy Turlington, Naomi Campbell, to surprise him at the top of the stairs in Kensington Palace. William, then 13, was so stunned he reportedly turned bright red and couldn't speak. Diana laughed about it for weeks. It was a mother creating a moment her son would never forget. She just didn't know how soon that memory would have to last him. The marriage between Charles and Diana had officially ended in 1996, but it had been over long before that. The affairs, the recriminations, the famous 1995 Panorama interview where Diana said, "There were 3 of us in this marriage," all of it played out in public. William, old enough to read the newspapers, old enough to hear the whispers at school, became his mother's confidant in ways no child should ever be expected to become. He was her emotional support, a friend of Diana's later revealed. She would cry on his shoulder. He was 12, 13 years old, and he was comforting his mother through the dissolution of her marriage. He was a child, but he became her protector. This role, protector, confidant, emotional anchor, would shape William in ways that took decades to understand. It would also create a guilt so profound that he would carry it silently for 26 years. Because on August 30th, 1997, when Diana called from Paris, William and Harry were busy playing with their cousins at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. They were children on summer holiday. Their mother wanted to talk to them, to hear their voices before bed, as she always did. The boys rushed the conversation. They wanted to get back to playing. William would carry the weight of that rushed conversation for the rest of his life. The phone call happened around 6 p.m. British time. Diana was at the Ritz Hotel in Paris with Dodi Fayed, enjoying what was supposed to be a brief romantic getaway before returning to her sons. The divorce was final. She was free. For the first time in her adult life, Diana was building something entirely her own. A relationship on her terms. A humanitarian career unconstrained by palace handlers. A future that belonged to her and no one else. The boys were at Balmoral with their father, their cousins Peter and Zara Phillips, and the Queen herself. It was a traditional royal summer. Brisk walks in the Scottish Highlands, fishing in the River Dee, barbecues supervised by Prince Philip wearing a Balmoral Macintosh apron that had seen better decades. The kind of holiday that had been happening the same way since Victoria wore the crown. When the phone rang, William and Harry were in the middle of something. What exactly? The accounts vary. Some say they were playing hide and seek through the castle's labyrinthine corridors. Others claim they were watching a film with their cousins. The precise activity doesn't matter. What matters is that 2 boys aged 15 and 12 were being children, and they wanted to get back to it. "We were running around doing things," Harry would reveal years later in his memoir Spare. "We rushed her off the phone." William has never publicly described that final conversation in detail, but those close to him have reported that the guilt of it has never fully left him. The last words he spoke to his mother were hurried, casual, the careless goodbye of a teenager who assumes there will always be another phone call, another visit, another chance to say the things that matter. 21 words. That's how Harry described it. Probably 21 words. That's how many I said to my mother the last time we spoke. Imagine carrying that number with you. 21 words. Replaying them. Counting them. Wishing you could take each one back and replace it with something that mattered more. The crash happened just after midnight. Mercedes-Benz S200, Pont de l'Alma Tunnel. Speed estimated between 60 and 70 miles per hour when the car struck the 13th pillar. Henri Paul, the driver, had a blood alcohol level 3 times the French legal limit. The paparazzi who had been chasing Diana's car all evening would later face investigation, though ultimately no charges of manslaughter were brought. Diana wasn't killed instantly. She was pulled from the wreckage alive, still conscious, reportedly asking, "Oh my God, what's happened?" She went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance. Doctors at Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital fought for 2 hours to save her. At 4 a.m. Paris time, 3 a.m. in Britain, she was pronounced dead. She was 36 years old. The news reached Balmoral around 3:45 a.m. Prince Charles was woken first. He took the call in his private quarters, listened in silence, and then made a decision that would be debated for decades. He didn't wake the boys. Not yet. He let them sleep for a few more hours, believing, perhaps correctly, perhaps not, that they would need their strength for what was coming. At 7 a.m., Charles walked into William's room. He sat on the edge of his son's bed and told him his mother was dead. What happens in a 15-year-old's mind at that moment? William has never described it publicly, not in full, but those who study childhood trauma understand the mechanism well enough. The brain protects itself. It goes numb. It disconnects. The full weight of the loss doesn't land all at once because landing all at once would be unsurvivable. William asked if his father was sure. He asked if there had been a mistake. He asked what they were supposed to do now. Harry, at 12, had a different reaction. He asked if it was true. He asked if his mother was really gone. And then, by his own account, he cried only once in the days that followed. Once, at the burial, as the coffin was lowered into the ground at Althorpe. "I cried once at the burial, and you know what? I felt guilty about that too," Harry wrote decades later. "I felt guilty that I wasn't crying more." 2 boys, 2 different responses to an impossible reality, but the same wound, the same absence that would echo through every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone that mothers are supposed to witness. The public grief was immediate and overwhelming. By dawn on August 31st, crowds were already gathering outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace. People who had never met Diana were openly weeping in the streets. The Union Jack over Buckingham Palace became a flashpoint of controversy. Tradition dictated that no flag flew over the palace when the monarch was not in residence, but the public demanded the flag at half-mast. The Queen, still at Balmoral with her grandsons, faced the first genuine crisis of her reign. Why wasn't she in London? Why wasn't the flag lowered? Why wasn't the royal family acknowledging the grief of the nation? These questions consumed the public discourse for the next several days, but they missed the point entirely. The Queen wasn't in London because she was in Scotland with 2 children who had just lost their mother. The flag wasn't the story. The boys were the story, and the boys were hidden away, protected from cameras, trying to comprehend a world that had shattered while they slept. What were the 12 days between Diana's death and her funeral really like for the 2 young princes? The answer, buried in small details and scattered accounts, reveals a pressure that would break most adults, let alone children. The 12 days between Diana's death and her funeral have become a kind of mythology. The people's princess lying in state, the mountains of flowers, the extraordinary public outpouring that nearly brought the monarchy to its knees. But inside Balmoral, the reality was both more mundane and more devastating. The Queen made a decision that was characteristically practical. Shield the boys from the news entirely. Newspapers were hidden. Televisions were turned off or tuned to programming that wouldn't mention Diana. Radios were confiscated. The goal was to create a bubble where William and Harry could grieve without the additional trauma of watching the world grieve too. It was, in some ways, an act of profound love. The Queen, who had lost her own father at a young age, understood something about royal grief that the public never quite grasped. When you grieve in public, your grief stops belonging to you. It becomes a performance, a commodity, a thing to be photographed and analyzed and judged. Elizabeth was trying to give her grandsons the one thing her position could still provide: privacy. But the bubble couldn't hold. Not completely. William later described walking through Balmoral's grounds and hearing the distant sound of bagpipes. A lone piper, somewhere on the estate, had begun playing Flowers of the Forest, the traditional Scottish lament for fallen warriors. The sound drifted across the hills, mournful and beautiful and impossible to escape. William stood there, a 15-year-old boy in the Scottish Highlands, listening to the music of mourning and knowing, without being told, that it was for his mother. There were other intrusions. The distant thwomp-thwomp of helicopter blades as news organizations tried to get aerial shots of the grieving royals. The knowledge, even unspoken, that beyond the castle walls an entire world was crying, and expecting the boys to cry with them. Charles, to his credit, tried to maintain normalcy. He took the boys fishing. He took them on long walks through the heather. He did what British fathers of his generation did best. He kept them moving, kept them occupied, kept them from sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of what had happened. But at night, when the activity stopped and the darkness settled over Balmoral, there was no escaping it. William shared a room with Harry. They talked in whispers, afraid of being overheard. What did they talk about? William has never fully revealed those conversations, but Harry has offered fragments in recent years. They talked about whether their mother had suffered. They talked about the paparazzi who had chased her car. They talked about what would happen to them now. And they talked about the funeral. The decision that would define William's public image for decades was made not by him, but for him. And it was a decision that no 15-year-old should ever have to face. The question of whether William and Harry would walk behind their mother's coffin was not originally a foregone conclusion. In fact, it was the subject of intense debate within the royal family and among the palace advisors who were frantically trying to plan a funeral that satisfied both royal protocol and the unprecedented public demand for a spectacle of grief. Diana's brother, Charles Spencer, was fiercely opposed. He believed the boys should be protected, shielded from a display that would be traumatic and exploitative. He later described the decision to have them walk as an act of emotional blackmail by palace officials who were more concerned with public perception than with the welfare of two grieving children. Prince Philip, the boy's grandfather, reportedly took a different view. "If I walk, will you walk with me?" he allegedly asked William. The implication was clear. The presence of the princes would be a unifying symbol for a nation in mourning. It would show strength. It would show continuity. It would show that the monarchy understood the gravity of what had been lost. William, at 15, was asked to make an impossible choice. Walk behind your mother's coffin in front of 2 billion people, or stay hidden and let the world wonder why you weren't there. Either way, the cameras would judge him. Either way, the commentary would be merciless. Either way, there was no right answer, only degrees of wrong. He chose to walk. Harry, only 12, was told he would walk too. He has since described the experience as surreal, dissociative, a kind of waking nightmare in which he kept his eyes fixed on the ground because looking up meant seeing the faces of thousands of weeping strangers who apparently believed his mother belonged to them as much as she belonged to him. The funeral procession began at Kensington Palace and wound through central London to Westminster Abbey. The route was lined with an estimated 1 million people. The silence was what witnesses remember most vividly. A silence so profound that the only sounds were the clip-clop of the horses' hooves, the tolling of the abbey bell, and the occasional wail of a mourner who couldn't contain their grief. William walked with his head down. His face was a mask of controlled anguish, the famous Spencer stoicism fighting a losing battle against the weight of the moment. Behind him, the coffin was draped in the royal standard, a white envelope visible on top. Inside that envelope was a card, placed there by William and Harry. It was addressed simply to Mummy. He has never revealed exactly what he wrote in that card, but a former palace insider, speaking anonymously years later, claimed it contained just 2 words. "I'm sorry." Sorry for what? For rushing off the phone? For not being able to protect her? For the divorce that had caused her so much pain? For being 15 and powerless and unable to do anything except walk in a straight line behind a coffin that contained the only person who had ever truly understood him? The funeral lasted just over an hour. The boys sat in the front row of Westminster Abbey, flanked by their father, their grandfather, and their uncle. Elton John performed a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind. Diana's brother delivered a eulogy that was part tribute, part indictment of the royal family, part promise that her blood family would protect William and Harry from the institution that had, in his view, destroyed her. And then it was over. The coffin was driven to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate, where Diana was buried on an island in the middle of an ornamental lake. The grave was inaccessible to the public, a final act of protection for a woman who had been afforded so little privacy in life. For William and Harry, The funeral was the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another. They returned to their lives as princes. They went back to school. They smiled for the cameras. They performed the role that had been assigned to them since birth. But something had broken. Something that wouldn't begin to heal for 26 years. The silence that followed Diana's death was not just William's. It was institutional. The royal family as a whole adopted an unspoken policy. Don't talk about Diana. Don't mention her name. Don't acknowledge the wound. And for 2 decades, that policy held, until it became clear that silence was destroying what it was meant to protect. In the years following the funeral, William became known for something that royal watchers found both admirable and concerning. His total refusal to discuss his mother publicly. Interviewers were warned in advance. Questions about Diana were off limits. The topic was simply not to be raised. This wasn't just emotional self-protection. It was strategy. The palace had learned from the chaos of 1997 that the public's appetite for Diana-related emotion was insatiable and dangerous. Every tear William shed would be analyzed. Every tremble in his voice would become a headline. The only winning move, the advisors concluded, was not to play. So William didn't play. He gave interviews about his charitable work, his military service, his eventual engagement to Kate Middleton. But when the subject turned to his mother, his face would close. His answers would become clipped. The message was unmistakable. This territory was forbidden. Behind the scenes, however, the reality was more complicated. William was struggling. Not obviously, not dramatically, but in the quiet ways that people struggle when they've experienced catastrophic loss and never been given space to process it. Friends from his university days at St. Andrews have described a young man who was charming and fun on the surface, but prone to sudden withdrawals, unexplained silences, moments when he would simply disconnect from the people around him and retreat into a private world where no one could follow. He drank, not excessively by student standards, but enough that those who knew him well recognized it as self-medication. The relationship with Kate Middleton, which began as friendship and blossomed into romance, became an anchor. Kate's family, stable, warm, uncomplicated, offered William something the royal family couldn't: normalcy. He spent Christmas with the Middletons. He joined them for Sunday lunches. He experienced for the first time what a family looked like when it wasn't fractured by divorce, protocol, and the weight of an empire. But even Kate couldn't reach the places where William had hidden his grief. Those places remained locked, guarded, buried so deep that even William himself had stopped trying to access them. The turning point came gradually. The birth of Prince George in 2013, then Princess Charlotte in 2015, then Prince Louis in 2018. William, holding his children for the first time, experienced something he hadn't anticipated: the visceral understanding of what it meant to have a mother and lose one. I think, when you have children of your own, you start to see your own childhood through a different lens. A royal correspondent who has followed William's journey closely explained. All the things Diana did for him, the secret trips, the treasure hunts, the unconditional affection, suddenly made sense. And so did the magnitude of what he'd lost. William began to talk about mental health, tentatively at first, then with increasing urgency. He partnered with Harry and Kate on Heads Together, a campaign aimed at destigmatizing mental health struggles. He spoke about the importance of emotional openness, of seeking help, of not suffering in silence. But he still didn't talk about Diana. Not directly, not publicly, not in the way that everyone knew he needed to. The dam finally began to crack in 2017, the 20th anniversary of Diana's death. William participated in a documentary about his mother, offering carefully measured reflections on her parenting and her legacy. He spoke of her sense of humor, her love of naughty music, her determination to give her sons normal experiences. It was more than he'd ever shared before, but it was still guarded, still controlled, still the public version of grief rather than the private one. What the world didn't know was that behind the scenes, William had begun seeing a therapist. Not a palace-approved counselor who would report back to the institution, but an independent professional who had no ties to the royal family. In those sessions, over the course of several years, William finally began to say the things he'd been holding inside since he was 15. He talked about the guilt, the phone call, the rushed goodbye, the terrible, irrational feeling that if he'd just stayed on the line a little longer, somehow everything would have been different. He talked about the anger, at the paparazzi, at the palace machinery that had ground his mother down, at his father for reasons so complicated they took years to untangle, at himself for not being old enough, strong enough, powerful enough to save her. He talked about the fear, the creeping terror that the same forces that had destroyed Diana would come for Kate, for his children, for him. The paranoia that made him scan crowds for threats. The nightmares that still woke him at 3 a.m., heart pounding, certain that history was repeating itself. And he talked about the love. The overwhelming, devastating love of a son for a mother who had been imperfect, complicated, sometimes chaotic, but who had loved him with a ferocity that the rest of his life had never quite matched. These sessions were never supposed to become public. They were private, therapeutic. The messy, non-linear work of actually healing rather than performing healing. But something shifted in the autumn of 2023. William, now 41 years old, a father of 3, the Prince of Wales with a clear view of his own future on the throne, made a decision. It wasn't announced. There was no press release. But those closest to him noticed a change. A quiet resolve. A sense that something long postponed was finally being confronted. He was ready to speak, not in a documentary, not through a spokesperson, not in carefully edited soundbites designed to satisfy public curiosity while protecting the institution. He was ready to say what he actually felt. The event was billed as a celebration of Diana's legacy, a gathering of the charities she had championed, the causes she had elevated, the lives she had touched. But those in attendance would later say they sensed something different in the air, something electric, something that felt like history. The Diana Legacy Awards ceremony had been held every 2 years since 2017, recognizing young people who embodied the princess's spirit of compassion and service. It was the kind of event William had attended before. Dutiful, dignified, carefully managed. He would say a few words about his mother's commitment to helping others. He would present the awards. He would pose for photographs. He would leave. That was the plan. The speech had been drafted weeks in advance, vetted by palace communications staff, approved by the private secretary's office. It was a good speech. Warm, respectful, appropriately personal without being uncomfortably so. The kind of speech that would generate positive headlines and then be forgotten within a news cycle. But something happened in the hours before the ceremony. What exactly, we may never know. Perhaps it was a conversation with Kate, who had always encouraged him to be more open about his grief. Perhaps it was a memory that surfaced unexpectedly. The sound of bagpipes across the Scottish hills, or the image of that white envelope on the coffin, or the last hurried words he'd spoken to his mother on a summer evening in 1997. Or perhaps it was simply this. William realized he was tired. Tired of protecting himself. Tired of managing his grief like a public relations asset. Tired of being the prince who couldn't cry when the son inside him had been weeping for 26 years. He arrived at Kensington Palace's state apartments looking, according to one attendee, unusually pensive. He greeted the award recipients, young people from across the Commonwealth who had done extraordinary work in their communities. He smiled for the cameras. He performed the role, but when he took the podium, something had changed. The first few sentences were from the prepared text. He spoke about the award's importance. He honored the recipients. He mentioned his mother's belief in the power of young people to change the world. Standard, safe, predictable. Then he paused. It wasn't a dramatic pause. It wasn't theatrical. It was the pause of a man who had reached the edge of a cliff and was deciding whether to step back or jump. When he spoke again, the words were not from the script. I've spent most of my life trying to be strong. That's what you're taught, isn't it? Princes don't cry. Future kings don't fall apart. You carry on. You do your duty. You keep moving forward because that's what's expected, and you don't want to let anyone down. The room, which had been filled with the quiet rustling of programs and the occasional cough, went completely still. But I need to tell you something I've never said publicly. Something I've barely been able to say to myself. He gripped the edges of the podium, knuckles wide, exactly as Diana had done during countless public appearances when she was nervous or emotional or both. I never told her goodbye. Not properly. The last time I spoke to my mother, I was 15 years old and in a hurry to get back to my cousins. She wanted to talk. She always wanted to talk. She loved knowing every detail of our days, what we'd eaten, what we'd done, what made us laugh. And I rushed her. I cut her off. I said I had to go. His voice cracked. Not dramatically, just a small fracture in the carefully maintained composure of a man who had been trained since birth to never show weakness in public. I've replayed that conversation thousands of times. I've imagined all the things I should have said. I love you, Mummy. Thank you for everything you've done for me. I'll see you soon. Simple things. Things any child should say to their mother when they say goodbye. But I didn't say them. I didn't know I would never get another chance. The silence in the room was no longer just attentive. It was emotional. People were holding their breath. Some were already crying. And I've spent 26 years feeling guilty about that. Guilty that my last words to her were rushed and ordinary. Guilty that I couldn't know what was about to happen. Guilty that I couldn't protect her, even though I was just a boy. Guilty that I've never been able to talk about it, because talking about it felt like I was failing somehow. Failing to be strong, failing to be royal, failing to be the man everyone expected me to be. He took a breath. A long one. The kind of breath that fills your lungs completely and then releases slowly. The way therapists teach you when you're about to say something that terrifies you. But I've learned something. Through a lot of difficult conversations, a lot of therapy, a lot of support from Catherine and my children, I've learned that the strength we're taught to value, the stiff upper lip, the keep calm and carry on mentality, that's not real strength. Real strength is admitting when you're broken. Real strength is saying, I'm not okay, and letting people help you. Real strength is telling the truth about your pain instead of hiding it behind a smile and a wave. The words were tumbling out now, no longer controlled, or measured, or strategic. This was not a prince speaking. This was a son. This was a husband and father who had finally, after decades of silence, given himself permission to be human. My mother knew this. She knew that vulnerability isn't weakness. She showed us that when she sat with AIDS patients, when she walked through minefields, when she held the hands of dying children. She wasn't afraid to feel things deeply, and she wasn't afraid to show it. That's what made her dangerous to the establishment. That's what made her extraordinary. And that's what I've been afraid to be. He paused again. And when he continued, his voice was steadier, not because he was regaining control, but because he had stopped trying to control anything. So tonight I'm breaking my own rule. I'm telling you that I miss my mother every single day, that there are mornings when I wake up and for a split second I forget she's gone. And then I remember, and it hits me like it just happened yesterday, that I've been angry, so angry, at the people who took her from us, at the institution that made her life so difficult, at myself for not being able to save her, that I've struggled with anxiety and sadness and all the things men aren't supposed to admit they struggle with. He looked out at the audience. Young people, many of them, who had overcome their own traumas and challenges, award recipients who had turned their pain into purpose, exactly as Diana had done. I'm telling you this because I don't want anyone else to spend 26 years carrying a weight that's too heavy for one person to carry. I don't want my children to grow up thinking that strength means silence. I don't want a single person in this room to believe that their grief is something to be ashamed of, something to hide, something to manage for the comfort of others. And I'm telling you this because I owe it to my mother. She spent her life teaching Harry and me that our feelings mattered, that we were allowed to cry. That being royal didn't mean being robotic. I've forgotten that lesson for a long time. I'm trying to remember it now. His final words were barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the room, they carried like a bell. Mommy, I'm sorry I didn't say this when I had the chance. I love you. I miss you. And I hope I'm making you proud. He stepped back from the podium. For a moment, he looked almost surprised at himself, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. Then the room erupted. The applause that followed wasn't the polite, measured applause of royal events. It was the raw, cathartic release of people who had witnessed something real. People were on their feet. Many were openly weeping. The award recipients, those remarkable young people who had been honored for their resilience and compassion, were crying the hardest. Because they understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to turn pain into power. What happened next at Kensington Palace felt almost surreal. The ceremony was supposed to continue. There were more awards to present, more speeches to give, more photographs to take. But the emotional gravity of what had just occurred made normal proceedings feel impossible. William didn't return to his seat. He stood at the side of the stage, accepting embraces from people he had never met. Young recipients approached him, tears streaming down their faces, and told him their own stories of loss. He listened to each one. He didn't rush them. He didn't look at his watch, or glance at his aides, or perform the subtle body language of someone eager to escape. A 17-year-old girl from Manchester, who had lost her mother to cancer at age 9, told him that his words had given her permission to finally talk about her own grief. A young man from Kenya who had been orphaned by AIDS, the very disease Diana had worked to destigmatize, thanked him for continuing his mother's work. An Australian volunteer who had survived domestic violence said she had never heard a man speak so honestly about pain. And William, the future King of England, stood there and wept with them. Not dignified, ceremonial tears. Not the single glistening droplet that photographers capture and newspapers publish with captions about showing emotion. This was real crying. His shoulders shook. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He laughed at himself once, a wet, embarrassed laugh that said, "I can't believe I'm doing this in public." But he didn't stop. He didn't apologize. He didn't retreat into the armor that had protected him for 26 years. The palace staff, who had been prepared for a standard royal engagement, scrambled to adjust. The cameras that had been recording the ceremony for the evening news had captured something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. The footage would be broadcast within hours, and within days it would be seen by hundreds of millions of people around the world. But in that moment, in that room, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a man who had been taught his entire life to hide his feelings had finally stopped hiding. A son who had been carrying guilt for a rushed phone call in 1997 had finally forgiven himself. A prince who had been told that his duty required emotional suppression had discovered that his real duty, the duty that mattered, was to be human. The embrace that defined the evening, captured in photographs that would dominate front pages worldwide, was between William and a woman named Margaret Asher, an 83-year-old former nurse who had worked with Diana on AIDS education in the 1990s. Margaret had known William when he was a boy. She had watched him grow up, watched him retreat into himself, watched him perform the role of prince so perfectly that the person underneath had nearly disappeared. She approached him with the confidence of someone who had known him long enough to ignore protocol. She took his face in her hands, the way grandmothers do, and looked at him directly. "Your mother," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet room, "would be so proud of the man you've become." "Not the prince, the man," William broke again. But this time, through the tears, he was smiling. It took nearly an hour for the ceremony to resume. When it did, the energy in the room had been transformed. This was no longer a formal royal event. It had become something else entirely. A collective moment of healing, of recognition, of the strange and beautiful way that one person's vulnerability can give permission to everyone else in the room. The speech, when it was broadcast and shared online, ignited something unprecedented. Within 24 hours, clips had been viewed more than 50 million times. News anchors who had covered the royal family for decades were visibly emotional on air. Mental health organizations reported a surge in calls to their helplines, not from people in crisis, but from people who said William's words had finally convinced them to seek help for grief they'd been carrying for years, sometimes decades. Britain, a nation famous for its emotional reserve, was crying with its future king, and somewhere in all those tears was relief. Relief that the long silence was finally broken, that the wound was finally acknowledged, that the boy who walked behind the coffin had finally, after all these years, spoken his truth. Why did this moment resonate so profoundly? Why did millions of people who had never met Diana, who had no connection to the royal family, find themselves weeping at the words of a prince they would likely never meet? The answer lies in something universal. Grief, when it remains unexpressed, becomes something heavier than grief. It becomes shame. It becomes guilt. It becomes the secret belief that we are doing something wrong by continuing to hurt, years or decades after the loss occurred. William's speech was powerful not because he was a prince, but because he was human. Because the thing he described, the hurried conversation, the casual goodbye, the years of replaying those final moments and wishing for a different ending, is something that millions of people have experienced. Every person who has ever lost someone they loved has at some point tortured themselves with the same questions. Did they know I loved them? Did I say everything I should have said? Could I have done something differently? William answered those questions not with platitudes but with his own story. His guilt about the rushed phone call, his 26 years of silence, his eventual realization that healing requires breaking the silence, not maintaining it. The significance for the monarchy cannot be overstated. For generations, the royal family has been defined by emotional restraint. The Queen herself was famously described as someone who never complains, never explains. The stiff upper lip was not just a personal choice. It was an institutional value, passed down through the generations like a crown jewel. William broke that tradition. Not casually, not recklessly, but deliberately, thoughtfully. in a way that honored his mother's legacy while acknowledging that the old way of doing things had caused immense suffering. In doing so, he offered a vision of monarchy that could connect with citizens not through ceremony and protocol, but through shared humanity. For Harry, watching from California, the speech must have been complicated. The brothers' relationship had fractured in recent years, damaged by the pressures of the institution, the relentless media scrutiny, and the publication of Harry's memoir. But William's words echoed themes that Harry had been trying to articulate for years. About the trauma of losing Diana, the inadequacy of the royal family's emotional support, the importance of therapy and openness. Whether the speech would help heal the rift between the brothers remained to be seen. But it demonstrated something significant. William had finally understood what Harry had been trying to tell him. The silence wasn't protecting anyone. The silence was a prison, and breaking free of it was the only path forward. For Kate, who had watched her husband struggle for years, the speech represented vindication. She had always encouraged William to be more open about his feelings, and she had provided the stable, loving environment that made such openness possible. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were being raised with an understanding of emotional health that William had never received as a child. They were allowed to cry. They were encouraged to talk about their feelings. They were loved not just as future royals, but as human beings. And for Diana, wherever she was, whatever remains of us after death, the speech must have felt like an answer. The boy she had raised to be kind, to feel deeply, to reject the emotional sterility of the institution she had fled, had finally come home to himself. He had stopped performing strength and discovered what she had known all along. That real strength is soft. That vulnerability is power. That love expressed openly is the only thing that lasts. The night ended quietly. After the last award was presented, after the final photographs were taken, after the guests had filtered out into the London darkness, William stood alone in the state apartments of Kensington Palace. This was the palace where he had grown up, where his mother had organized treasure hunts and surprised him with supermodels at the top of the stairs, where he had heard her crying through closed doors during the worst days of the divorce, where he had walked out on September 6, 1997, to follow her coffin through streets packed with weeping strangers. The palace was quiet now. The staff had retreated. Outside, the eternal London traffic hummed its endless song. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and faded. William looked at a photograph on the wall, one of the informal portraits Diana had commissioned, showing her with her boys, laughing, not posing. The kind of photograph that the old guard of the palace had considered undignified, but that Diana had insisted on. Real, she had called it. This is what real looks like. He had been real tonight. For the first time in his public life, he had let the world see the person behind the title. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was, he would later tell a friend, like setting down a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. There would be consequences, of course. The tabloids would have their opinions. The traditionalists would mutter about the decline of royal standards. The Republican movement would try to weaponize his vulnerability as weakness. And somewhere in California, Harry might be feeling something complicated. Pride, perhaps, or sadness, or hope that the brother he remembered from childhood was still in there somewhere. But in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a 15-year-old boy had finally forgiven himself for a rushed phone call. A man had finally said goodbye to his mother in the way he'd always wished he could. And a nation that had been mourning for 26 years had finally been given permission to heal. William turned from the photograph and walked toward the door. Tomorrow would bring briefings and meetings and the endless machinery of royal life. But tonight, he was just a son who had finally told the truth. And somewhere, in the quiet of memory, a voice answered him, not in words, not in anything that could be recorded or photographed or analyzed, but in the warmth that sometimes fills a room when you're thinking of someone you loved and you realize they've never really left you at all. The door closed. The palace settled into silence. And outside, in the gardens where Diana had once planted flowers with her boys, a light rain began to fall. Soft and steady, like a mother's hand on a sleeping child's forehead, like the first tears of a long-awaited release. If you're enjoying thoughtful royal stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Hunny Palace. Your support helps us bring more untold royal stories, hidden history, and emotional documentaries every week. In the end, perhaps that's what all grief asks of us. Not that we move on, but that we move forward. Not that we forget, but that we finally speak the words we've been holding in our hearts. William spoke those words on a cool autumn night in the palace where he grew up. And in speaking them, he reminded us of something Diana always knew. That love is stronger than protocol. That vulnerability is braver than silence. And that a mother's voice, even in memory, can guide her children home. The boy who walked behind the coffin is 41 years old now. He has children of his own. He has a future that includes a crown and a throne and responsibilities that most of us can barely imagine. But underneath all of that, he is still Diana's son. And tonight, finally, he told her everything he'd been holding in his heart since he was 15. Mummy, I love you. Mummy, I miss you. Mummy, I hope I'm making you proud. He is. He always has been. And now at last he knows it.